We did. It's important to address the review and permitting process. So currently, it requires a special use permit, essentially, for any smaller lots. There's a way you could do it where it doesn't, maybe it's something the city council wouldn't want to review. And then, as far as cleaning and disposal requirements, certainly you could put those in regulations, but those types of regulations are difficult to enforce. There's a way to do it, but it's difficult to enforce. If you have if you have standards in the zoning code, you could have companion standards in the animal ordinance that's administered by the police department, and they can complement one another. And so that's one way you can kind of control it, because those are issued on an annual basis. As you're looking at chickens, I think you can anticipate inquiries about livestock and beekeeping. Livestock, I think, is a real problem in an urban environment. Beekeeping is not something that's that unusual, and even larger cities have permitted beekeeping. Big cities have permitted the keeping of hives on the roofs of mid-rise buildings. So there's a way to do that. If you're looking at bee stings, you might not think it's a great idea. Just saying. So I'll take any questions or comments.
I had a specific question. It was about city ordinance versus, like, say, the HOA, homeowner association regulations or requirements. I don't know if it's necessarily obvious, but there's a lot of areas in Gardner that have subdivisions that don't have HOAs because of the fact that, you know, the developer went out of business before an HOA could be created or something like that. So obviously, in this case, what would happen, the city policy would then govern what happens in those R1 areas. If there is an HOA, they could pass supplementary rules or guidelines or enforce a different code within their own neighborhood, correct?
Well, I've had a lot of questions over the years about how do HOA rules work. Mm-hmm. And the answer that I've given people is, well, you need to comply with both. I mean, both the covenants from your homeowner association that are administered by the homeowner association and the city regulations. It's just that the city doesn't enforce the covenants, codes, and restrictions in a subdivision. That's up to the HOA. HOAs, if they're not active, it's difficult for them to do that. But it's really between the HOA and their residents. The city is not involved. So, you know, the city could pass all the ordinances at once, but if that type of use is not permitted by the covenants, codes, and restrictions of the subdivision, then the residents are violating what are really civil type matters between them and the HOA.
So is it safe, I mean, in your experience, the HOAs are, at minimum, city code, they could have more stringent requirements?
Yes, and that's quite often the case.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do we know how many special use permits are issued currently? Like, is there anybody right now that has a special use permit for urban, I mean, for animals or chickens?
I am not aware of anybody who has a special use permit of the type that's administered through the zoning code and it's approved by the governing body. The police department might have issued special use permits.
Not for those type of animals. The only ones that I can recall in the last couple, 3 years is when it comes to the number of dogs and cats that you have. When it refers to these barnyard type animals, those are always deferred to community development because of the special use permit that they have to have for that.
So has anybody even applied, except for I remember the miniature horse, but I didn't know if there's anybody that has recently applied for a special use permit?
No one has recently applied. We've gotten a number of inquiries about chickens, and our answer has been just citing a code and what they're required to do, and no one has applied.
Now, you make a very good point, by the way, on the restrictions on just basically the amount of land that you have in these plots. I mean, there's not very many large lots in Gardner. I mean, I know there's some on the south side of town, you know, and some out west. like Genesis Farms, places like that. But it's mostly, especially the older neighborhoods, there's very small lots, very small houses. Be very difficult, I think, even if you put in, 40-foot setbacks, it's not gonna necessarily lend itself to a chicken coop and a run. I mean, am I correct in saying that?
Well, I think that map kind of demonstrates that certainly a 100-foot setback, if the city wanted to permit them, but place a 100-foot setback
It
from a
wouldn't work.
dwelling, that wouldn't work. 80-foot setback wouldn't work. 40 feet might work. I'm not sure it matters that much, but
Yeah.
certainly you wouldn't want a chicken run right out someone's bedroom window.
No.
Yeah.
Mike, in the research, Olathe was all by special use permit, correct? So if you wanted to have chickens at your home, if you wanted to do it by the letter of the law, you had to apply for a special use permit, correct?
That's correct, and I spoke with someone with the city of Olathe, and they have processed some special use permit applications.
Is theirs approval by the police department, or is it by the planning commission, or do they have to go to council? I'm just curious how actually to get that special use permit issued.
I'm speaking through the zoning ordinance, so it does have to go to city council.
It would have to go to the city council.
And with that, do they have very specific guidelines? See, I guess anytime you say special use permit, I start to get nervous because
The steps
it's
to
very
get-
open, exactly.
Is that
And-
case-by-case basis?
Yeah, and I just don't think that's right. I mean, I think we need to be clear, and if we're gonna be clear and say these are the guidelines, why do you need a special use permit?
Yeah.
I mean,
So when I think of the special use permit, actually exactly what you're talking about, without the special use permit, you just draft regulations, I guess it does two things. It gives you the opportunity for awareness and enforcement, and even if it's a checklist special use permit it's like a building permit, where they have to come out and they have to do an inspection that you're going to be able to meet these criteria that's already drafted out, and it's clearly defined. So at that point, it's almost, and I haven't done a building permit for like a fence, but I would expect it to be a similar process where correct me if I'm wrong, but a fence special use permit doesn't have to be much more than a hand-drawn thing with your property lines dragged out, correct?
Well, for a fence permit, and that's a fence permit, so that's something that's issued over the counter,
Right.
and that's just draw us a diagram on a map, and it's issued by staff. The special use permit
Right.
that I keep referring to out of Title 18, so out of the zoning code, is a special use permit application. It requires a public hearing. There's an application fee, I think it's $300, application fee, application, public hearing, notice, goes to planning commission, they make a recommendation, goes to the city council. It's a lot of, might be appropriate, but there's a lot of work and time that goes into that, and a certain level of uncertainty doesn't make sense.
Okay.
There's a high level of uncertainty to the applicant whether they're gonna get that. To answer another question that you brought up, it is not that unusual to have special use permit provisions in a code and have standards for each of those special use special uses. So there's a way to do that. So I think some of the issues are, is this something the governing body would want to see? In other words, issue the permit, should staff work on something that would provide either A, more certainty to what the standards are, because currently there aren't really any standards, and B, should it be easier to get them? Should it require a special use permit?
I think we need
That's
to
the governing
speak
body.
about this after the meeting, don't you
Yeah.
think? Because we're just
Yeah.
getting started
Yeah.
on
Okay.
this issue, I think.
Okay, and that's, hang tight with us after adjournment from the city council meeting, and we will continue this discussion. So, with that being the case, it's now 7 o'clock, so Gardner City Council will come to order. I invite everybody to please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay.
agenda is public comments.